All right, moving along with René Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. We are on Chapter 6, the Section 2 of the book, which is entitled The Enigma of Myth Resolved. The Chapter 5 was entitled Mythology. Chapter 6 is entitled Sacrifice. It's a rather shorter chapter, just a few 4 or 5 pages. So we'll begin. Thanks to the talent of Philostratus, the violence of the Ephesians, at first so moved by compassion for their victim, is displayed with a realism so modern that we cannot elude its representation. As enamored as we are of myth, we cannot fail to understand the role of violent unanimity in the illusion that mythology creates. The primitive sacred is generated by mimetic snowballing and the single victim mechanism. The communities pacified and reconciled by their victims are too conscious of their inability to become reconciled by their own actions, not to imagine that some God has brought them together, and that God has to be that same victim who inflicted evil on them, but who now bestows benefits on them. In the Miracle of Apollonius, the experience is not intense enough to bring about the second transformation, in which the victim who is demonized is turned into the God who bestows benefits. That is why the admirers of our guru found it necessary to resort to a god of the traditional pantheon in order to lend support to the miracle. If the experience of mimetic contagion had been stronger, the persecutors would have attributed their deliverance directly to their victim, who would take on the roles of both evil demon and beneficent deity. When the transforming power weakens, the second transference, the divination of the victim, disappears first. The first transference, scapegoat, not the second, is certainly present in our story. The more precarious of the two, the second transference, when it emerges, covers up the demonic and conceals from human eyes what Philostratus obliges us to contemplate, the projection of the community's accumulated scandals on the unfortunate beggar, mimetic violence, the foundation of primitive religion in its totality. Philostratus is not sensitive to violence in the way our historical era obliges us to be. Such lack of sensitivity is shocking. So shocking to us is one of the historical problems that the analyses I offer should help us to grasp. The double transference of the primitive sacred explains the logical flaw that characterizes numerous myths. In the beginning of the latter, the hero passes for a dangerous criminal and nothing more. After the violence intended to prevent him or her from inflicting further harm on the community, this same scapegoat appears in the conclusion as the divine savior, though this change of identity is never justified or even pointed out. At the end of these myths, the criminals of the beginning, now duly divinized, preside at the reconstruction of the cultural system they seem to have destroyed in the initial phase when they were the object of hostile projections, when they were only scapegoats. Formerly, religion was regarded as dreamlike, as fantastic. Today, it is celebrated as playful creation. In reality, world mythology is very close to the type of fable creation that has always been generated by collective violence in all traditional societies, even again somewhat in the medieval period when great panics occurred, occasioned by calamities such as the Black Plague. The victims then were Jews, lepers, foreigners, the disabled, the marginal people of every kind that excluded, we say in our time. The excluded that we say in our time. In the medieval instances, the mythic transformation is still weaker than in the Philostratus text. And in our day, the demystification I am proposing does not scandalize anyone at all, for it is perceived as so evident that it goes without saying. It is the opposite attitude that would scandalize our contemporaries, that is, if we did not recognize in these medieval phenomena the scapegoat violence that they truly embody. What we still refuse to see is that foundational myths embody the same violence as well. We can, starting from the preceding analysis, compare the origin of myths and their later weaker versions to the action of the volcano now extinct. When it was active, this volcano produced real myths, but it spewed out so much lava and smoke that it was impossible to lean over the crater to see what was happening inside. The stoning at Ephesus is the work of this same volcano in a later period. It is still glowing, but has cooled off enough that one can approach it. Though not completely inactive, it produces only truncated myths, amputated, limited to hostile transference upon a victim. The beggar of Ephesus never becomes an object of adoration. The miraculous stoning produces only a mediocre little demon. So I see the account given by Philostratus as a precious missing link between the full mythological transformations on the one hand, which are not directly decodable, and the transformations easy to decode on the other hand, such as the medieval witch hunt. The kinship of the witch hunt to mythology properly so-called becomes evident in the light shed by Philostratus and the Gospels. In both cases, we have collective violence revolving around a false interpretation, governed as it is by the unanimous illusion of the persecutors. Standing before the myths, we remain the dupes of transformations that are no longer capable of fooling us in the case of the witch hunt. When we deal with the persecutions that occur in our historical world, we can see, though, through the lies of the persecutors and understand that the victims must be real and must be viewed as innocent even though the persecutions are far removed in time. We understand that we would be not only foolish, but would incur guilt to deny the innocence of the victims. We don't want to make ourselves accomplices of the witch hunt. Mythology is a more powerful version of the transformational process whose functioning we demystify easily in the witch hunt because the process doesn't work any longer in our world except in very weakened form, one incapable of producing true myths. Myths properly named are part of the same textual family as the stoning instigated by Apollonius, the medieval phenomenon of the witch hunt, or again the Passion of Christ. Reports of collective violence are intelligible in inverse proportion to the degree of transformation they have undergone. The most transformed are the myths, and the least transformed of all is the Passion of Christ, the only account that completely reveals the cause of violent unanimity, which is a mimetic contagion, the contagion of violence. What I am arguing, in short, is that the mythology that appears most noble, that of the Olympian gods, depends on the same textual origin as the demonization of the Ephesus beggar or the medieval witches. The connection of mythology and the witch hunt may seem scandalous because of the aesthetic and cultural veneration with which we surround mythology, but our sense of outrage must dissolve before a serious comparison of the two structures. In both instances, we find the same facts organized in the same fashion, though they have become much weakened in our so-called historical world, our Christian world. As the gods age, of course, their evil dimension becomes blurred to the advantage of their beneficent side, but vestiges of the original demon always remain, that is, the victim who was collectively massacred. If we are content to repeat the standard cliches about the Olympian gods, we will see only their majesty and their serenity. In classical art, the positive elements are generally in the foreground, but behind them, even in the case of Zeus, there are the wild pranks of the god, as they are called with an indulgence that is a little silly. Everyone agrees to excuse these escapades with a knowing, complicit smile, as if it were a little like youth who sow their wild oats, or like an American president caught in the flagrant act of adultery. The escapades of Zeus and his fellow gods are supposedly only weak shadows of their divine grandeur. In reality, the wild pranks are the traces of crimes similar to those of Oedipus and other divinized scapegoats, parricide, incest, bestial fornication, and other horrible crimes. All of these are accusations typical of witch hunts, with which primitive mobs are permanently obsessed, as are modern crowds seeking to find victims. The wild pranks are essential to the primitive phenomenon of divinity. Thank God for the historians of the Middle Ages. They refuse to deny the reality of witch hunts. The phenomena they decode are too numerous, too intelligible, and too well documented to be easily sacrificed, so far at least, to the god of turning these matters into fiction that has taken hold of our philosophers and mythologists. The historians continue to affirm the actual existence of the victims massacred by medieval mobs, lepers, Jews, foreigners, women, those who are disabled, marginal persons of every sort. We would be not only naive but guilty if we tried to deny the reality of these victims under the pretext that all such stories are obviously imaginary, that in any case the truth as such does not exist, etc. Now, if the victims of the medieval witch hunts are real, why wouldn't the victims of these myths also be? What prevents the mythologists from discovering the truth is not the intrinsic difficulty of the task, but their excessive respect for ancient Greece. a respect that has lasted for centuries and that has comes to be extended to all non-Western cultures. This undue respect is a function of the anti-Western and especially anti-Christian ideology that prevents the demystification of mythic forms, which we are now really in a position to decipher. I'm waiting with impatience for the day when scholars finally realize that in the myths they are dealing with the same themes as with witch hunts. Though these myths are structured in the same fashion, they are falsely perceived as indecipherable. The truth is, they have been deciphered for 2,000 years. The Gospel Passions accounts have solved the riddle. The interpretation I propose is not at all absurd or fantastic. Rather, it becomes evident from the moment we approach it from the angle of the missing link that we find in the stoning of Ephesus' beggar, which mediates between the reports of collective violence still capable of deceiving us, being mythic in strong sense, and those in which we immediately recognize the illusions of the persecutors mystified by their own acts of persecution. The stoning at Ephesus is of great interest because it demolishes the overly rigid distinctions of those who would prefer to imprison reality in well-defined categories. Linguistic structuralism avoids focusing upon texts like the one written by Philostratus, and for good reason. Philostratus steps over too many barriers that are now viewed as insuperable. Behind the discontinuity of language, our missing link makes visible a real continuity, bearing a real intelligibility which cannot be locked up in the watertight compartments of ancient and modern classifiers. The famous linguistic methods are much appreciated nowadays because they replace the search for truth with structuralist word games. The Ephesus stoning is not properly speaking a myth, and yet with the aid of the Gospels, it has suggested to us a hypothesis about the nature and origin of myths and gods that come as a direct extension of this text, a hypothesis difficult to reject for those who still believe in reality. The same holds for ritual sacrifices. While the Ephesus stoning is not strictly a sacrifice, it visibly maintains close ties to a certain type of sacrifice widespread in the Greek world. It is immediately reminiscent of a ritual that is so close to what Philostratus recounts that it is tempting to have recourse to it for a definition of the miracle of Apollonius. It is the ritual of the pharmakos. The beggar picked by Apollonius recalls the kind of homeless persons whom Athens and the great Greek cities fed at their expense in order to make use of them as pharmaci. When the appointed time arrived, that is, collectively to assassinate them, why back away before the proper term? During the Thargelia and other Dionysian festivals. Before stoning these poor wretches, the torturers sometimes struck or whipped their sexual organs and in general made them submit to a full round of ritual torture. Apollonius knows what he is doing when he chooses a victim no one will mourn, for in this way he doesn't risk aggravating the disorder he is trying to pacify. It is good strategy. The beggar's stone displays all the classical features of the pharmakos, features we see likewise in all human victims of sacrificial rituals. To avoid arousing reprisals, the torturers choose social nobodies, the homeless, those without family, the disabled and ill, abandoned old people, all those in short who bear the preferential signs for being selected as victims. The signs I discussed in The Scapegoat. These signs or features change hardly at all from one culture to another. Their constancy contradicts cultural relativism. In our own day, they still determine acts of exclusion. Those who bear them are no longer murdered, and that is progress, though it is precarious and limited. We hear it suggested all too easily that the Greeks of the classical era were too civilized to be devoted still to rituals as barbarous as that of the pharmakos. Some will argue, though without evidence to support it, that these rituals must have quickly fallen into disuse. But our miraculous stoning, some 6 centuries after Socrates and Plato, does not confirm this rosy optimism. The Dionysian cult carried on rites even more atrocious than the miracle of Apollonius, but we do not see them literally, not in the sense that which the accounts of Philostratus, almost like a film, force us to see the stoning at Ephesus. The blinking eyes of the beggar, the crust of bread in his sack, the initial compassion of the Ephesians, all these concrete details increase the evocative power of Philostratus' text. It would be tempting to conclude that even if the event narrated is real, it must be too exceptional to figure in a debate over violence in the pagan religions. To the contrary, I say, the account Philostratus gives us is not exceptional at all, except for its realism and its relative modernism. The Pharmakos rituals were supposed to purify the Greek cities of their illnesses and render them more harmonious. They were supposed, in short, to accomplish the kind of miracle that Apollonius worked with his beggar. In a period of crisis, all sacrificial cultures resort to rituals not provided in the normal liturgical calendar. The stoning of the beggar is an improvised Pharmakos ritual. In having the beggar stoned, Apollonius inflicted on a human victim the unanimous violence that most sacrifices no longer reproduced in his period except on animal victims. Theater performances are also rooted in collective violence and are a form of ritual. Though even more cleansed of violence than animal sacrifices, they are culturally richer than the animal sacrifices since they are, at least indirectly, meditations on the origins of religion and culture as a whole. As such, they are potential sources of knowledge, as Sandor Goodhart shows us in his Sacrifice commentary. But the goal of tragedy is the same as sacrifice. It always aims at producing among the members of the community a ritual purification, the Aristotelian catharsis, which is an intellectualized or sublimated version of the original sacrificial effect. In the period when sacrificial rites were still effective in some cultures, when researchers asked people in the communities why they practiced them so carefully, they always got the same double response. According to the people directly involved, and perhaps it is time to listen to what they believed, sacrifices were intended, 1, to please the gods, who had prescribed them to the community, and 2, to consolidate or restore, if need be, the order and peace of the community. In spite of the unanimity of these responses, anthropologists have never taken them seriously. I think this is why they have never resolved the enigma of sacrifice. To resolve it, we must accept that the sacrificers were telling the truth as they understood it. They were much closer to the explanation of their own rituals than all our contemporary specialists. Bloody sacrifices are attempts to repress or moderate the internal conflicts of primitive or archaic communities, and they do this by reproducing as exactly as possible, at the expense of the victims substituted for the original victim, a real act of violence that had occurred in the indeterminate past. This original violence had really reconciled these communities, thanks to its unanimity. The gods are always involved in the sacrifices because the collective acts of violence that the sacrifices intend to reproduce are the same ones that at some point in the past had spontaneously reconciled these communities. And because the communities are reconciled, the beneficiaries are persuaded that the victims are divine. In short, it is always an effective single victim mechanism that works as a model for the sacrifices because it has ended a mimetic crisis, an epidemic of multiple acts of vengeance that the community could not control. The proof that sacrifices are modeled after real acts of violence is that their fundamental features are always the same even if they differ in details. It is obviously the model of spontaneous collective violence that inspires them. The resemblance between sacrificial systems from one end of the earth to the other are certainly too constant and inexplicable to lend credence to the imaginary or psychological concepts of sacrifice. To understand how these rituals are born, let us imagine a community's state of mind when, after a period of bloody conflict, it is delivered from its misfortune by an unexpected mob action. In the early days or months that followed this deliverance, it is likely that a great euphoria prevailed. But sadly, this blessed period never lasted. Humans are so constituted that they always fall back into their mimetic rivalries. Scandal must occur, and it always does occur, sporadically at first, and little attention is paid to it. But soon it begins to proliferate. Now those affected must face facts. A new crisis threatens the community. How to prevent this disaster? The community has not forgotten the strange, incomprehensible drama that some time ago drew it up from the abyss, where the community now fears it will fall again. It is full of gratitude toward the mysterious victim who plunged it initially into that disaster, but who subsequently saved it. When the people involved reflect on these strange events, they must say to one another that if the whole process unfolded as it did, it was without doubt because the mysterious victim wanted it that way. Perhaps this god has organized this entire scenario with the purpose of arousing his new worshippers to reproduce it and renew its effects so that in the future they will be protected from a possible reoccurrence of mimetic disorder. The idea that the gods have instructed humans to offer them sacrifice is universal, and it is easy to see what justifies this. Perhaps the deities want these sacrifices to be repeated perpetually for the good of their faithful. Perhaps also for their own benefit, because they feel honored by the rituals, or perhaps because the sacrificed victims nourish them. Not knowing precisely why collective violence is such a good thing, but suspecting perhaps that it is not effective only in the supernatural sphere, the communities proceed to copy their experience of violent unanimity in a fashion as exact and complete as possible. In the case of uncertainty, better to do much than not enough. This principle explains why so many communities incorporate the mimetic crisis itself into their rituals, the crisis that set off the mimetic process of selecting the original victim. In many sacrificial rituals, everything begins with an acting out of mimetic crisis, which is too realistic and similar to the real thing to be invented. All the subgroups quarrel and confront each other in a symmetry of opposition, which is to say mimetically. The model can be done other than the real crisis that triggered the very process that the community tries to reproduce, unanimous violence against the victim. So to produce its own antidote, violence must initially intensify and escalate. Many sacrificial systems certainly have a good intuition of this. Thus, they consider it necessary to reproduce the crisis, without which the single victim mechanism might not be triggered. This is why so many rituals quite clearly intended to reestablish order began with tumult of disorder, a spectacular disturbing of the peace and order of the community. This seems paradoxical, but from the mimetic perspective, it is very logical. But even if it is rational behind its apparent absurdity, the initial disorder is not universal in the rituals. Many ritual systems do not represent the initial crisis. We can easily understand why. This crisis is an unleashing of mimetic violence. If we should imitate too realistically, the risk of a total loss of control is great, and many communities refuse to assume it. Probably they felt that there would always be enough disorder among them to trigger the reconciling mechanism without adding to it a supplementary acting out of violence. Even the most tumultuous rituals did not usually reproduce mimetic crisis in all its intensity and duration. Those involved were more often content with an abbreviated and accelerated version of disorder. In other words, you don't have to jump into the fire to learn how to avoid getting burnt. We thus understand why those offering sacrifice almost universally saw their sacrifices as awesome acts. They realized that the only good violence, the violence that ends violence rather than intensifies it, is unanimous violence. They also realized that the motive force of unanimity is mimetic contagion, which increases in intensity and becomes more and more dangerous as long as it does not achieve unanimity. This is the source of the idea, universal in origin, that ritual activity is extremely dangerous. To diminish the risk, the community would try to reproduce the model as exactly and meticulously as possible. Psychologists and psychoanalysts have fallaciously construed this concern for exactness as neurosis, phantasms, and other complexes with which they are infatuated. To a certain type of modern mind, it seems obvious that religion is based on psychological illness. To dispel these modern illusions, we must discover the real action that the people offering sacrifice reproduced, the violence that is reconciled because it is spontaneously unanimous. As ritual traditions continue through time, a period inevitably arrives when the countless repetitions wear out their sacrificial effectiveness. The terror that their own sacrifices inspires in the apprentice sorcerers, as the sacrifices could be called, finally disappears. It survives only in the form of comedies or of terror intended to impress the uninitiated women and children. A great mass of evidence, theoretical, textual, and archaeological, suggests that in the beginning of humanity, the sacrificial victims were human. With the passing of time, animals more and more replaced humans, but almost everywhere human communities viewed animal victims as less efficacious than human victims. In cases of extreme danger, in classical Greece, for instance, there was a revision to human victims. If we can believe Plutarch, on the eve of the Battle of Salamis, Themistocles had Persian prisoners sacrificed because of pressure from the crowd. Is this so different from the miracle of Apollonius? That ends of the chapter. Thanks for listening.